This is Lisa from Mobile Tech Review, and this is the 2018 13-inch MacBook Pro, which physically looks identical to the 2017 and 2016 13-inch MacBook Pro models. So this time around, Apple has decided to refresh the Touch Bar models only. Right now, the non-Touch Bar is still stuck at last generation Intel Core i7 CPUs. Nothing has changed there, and the price hasn't gone down either. Go figure. Who knows what's going to happen with that? Anyway, we have the base model of the Touch Bar, which sells for $1,799, $1,800. Pretty expensive, right? You get a Core i5, and as usual, Apple has done what they do with the 13-inch MacBook Pro, which is a good thing. They use a special 28-watt Intel CPU inside. This is the Coffee Lake U series, and this is somewhere in between the 15-watt Ultrabook CPUs that we see in competing Windows laptops and in that non-Touch Bar Mac. And they're 6-core these days, 45-watt CPUs used in the 15-inch MacBook Pro gaming laptops, mobile workstations. So performance is better than average. That's always stood in favor of the 13-inch MacBook Pro. You still have 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports supporting USB-C Gen 2 and no legacy ports other than a headphone jack. So yes, it's still dongle hell. Oh, goody, goody, goody. And inside we still have the same 720p FaceTime camera, no Face ID yet. But inside now we have the Apple T2 coprocessor, which replaces the T1. It handles the Touch Bar functionality. It handles Touch ID. So we have the fingerprint scanner built in here. It handles drive encryption, SSD stuff, all of that sort of thing. Also, we have a 3rd gen Butterfly keyboard, which feels pretty much the same as the last gen. Maybe a hair bit more tactile, but it's a little bit quieter. Apple says that's what they did to change it with the 3rd generation. But those of you who watched my 15-inch MacBook Pro review know that they also put little silicone membranes under each key. Could be to quiet it, but it also happens to match up with their patent for a dust ingress protection system. So each little key has its own little silicone condom underneath. Probably does keep out dust. It does make it a teeny bit quieter. We're going to look at it now. So again, we have the Core i5 model, and this is kind of an oddball CPU number because pretty much only Apple is probably going to use this. The 28-watt CPUs are not usually used by any other Windows laptop manufacturer. It's the 2.3 gigahertz Core i5-8259U. It has Turbo Boost to 3.8 gigahertz. You can get it with the Core i7 as well. We'll talk a little bit about upgrades later. They are pricey upgrades. Personally, I think in terms of thermals and in terms of performance, the Core i5 is plenty good enough. The Core i7 really is the same architecture, just a higher clock speed pretty much. This is a quad-core CPU, 4 cores, which we've seen in the Windows Ultrabook family where they went from 2 cores to 4 cores with their 15-watt CPUs. So same doubling of cores here, potential doubling of performance for applications that use multiple cores, which many applications do these days because multiple core CPUs have been around for, gosh, a long time now. And Apple isn't exaggerating about that performance, nor were PC manufacturers when they went from 2 to 4 cores and said, wow, performance is just about double. It's noticeably faster. In fact, if you take a look at the graph we have of handbrake encoding times, my usual test file is shot with an iPhone at 4K. And then what I do is I take it and I convert it down using Handbrake to using H.265 format, which uses the CPU, so it's a good CPU test, down to a 1080p 30 frame per second video. And you can see the performance there is really very excellent. Obviously, lower is better. It means it took less time to do that, and it's closer to the mobile workstation speed products like the Razer Blade 15 and gaming laptops than it is to your usual Windows 15-watt quad-core Ultrabook like our Lenovo ThinkPad X380 Yoga, which is a Core i5-8250U. So somewhat like the 15-inch MacBook Pro, it doesn't look like the laptop spends a lot of time peaking in Turbo Boost. Not quite as much as with the 15-inch, but still, it's odd because the performance overall, as you saw, is quite good, and it's up to 35 to 40% faster for some tasks that are well optimized on the Mac. For example, Adobe Lightroom performs well on the Mac. Obviously, Apple's own Final Cut performs well on the Mac. Handbrake performs well on the Mac. And as always, Adobe Premiere, not so much. It's just not well optimized for the Mac. With the graphics and CPU temperatures and something like Cinebench R15, which is pretty demanding, one of the tests that we do when we test Windows laptops and gaming laptops particularly is to run that test back to back over and over again, 5 to 10 times, because usually that score will drop as it gets hotter. the CPU has to throttle back. And guess what? With this one, it didn't throttle at all, which is actually very excellent performance. In fact, the score sometimes went up 1 or 2 points. So the thermal situation here is well handled. And as always with Apple, to them it's very important that it's not particularly hot to the touch. It does get hotter than the 15-inch because there's less space to dissipate heat, but it's not burning hot, it's not uncomfortable, but it can get toasty if you're pushing it hard, certainly. The keyboard area, it's great. Fan noise is usually pretty quiet, and that's one criticism I have of Apple. Like I said, I would use a program called Max Fan Control, M-A-C-S. So that program will let you actually control fan speeds, which in this case means raise them. We have Intel Iris Plus 655 graphics. Again, Apple always does this with the 13-inch MacBook Pro. You get a step up from the usual Intel UHD 620 graphics, so a little bit better performance. This is still not a gaming laptop and not anything close. It doesn't have dedicated graphics, but it gives a little extra oomph, which is nice if you're doing something like Final Cut, anything that's going to use the GPU, and for older or casual games. We're still using DDR3 low power RAM here. Only the 15-inch MacBook Pro moved up to DDR4. So yeah, it could be a little bit faster if they use DDR4. It could go up to 32 gigs, but I think in the 13-inch line, they're thinking that maybe you're happy with 16. You have to be happy with 16. That's the maximum. I think for a laptop that starts at $1,800, it's giving you only 8 gigs of RAM is borderline offensive. You're going to have to pay $200 more to get 16 gigs of RAM. But while Apple upgrades are usually pretty expensive, that's pretty fair because RAM prices are pretty high these days, so that's not too much of a markup. We already know how much the RAM upgrade costs. Now, say you want to go up to 16 gigs of RAM, still sticking with like a Core i5, and a 512 gig SSD, which is what you're going to find on, say, an HP Spectre X360 or a Lenovo Yoga 921, the competitors for around $1,200 or so. Well, I hate to tell you that that's going to bring up the price of this to like $2,200, which is about the cost of the entry-level Razer Blade 15, a much more powerful laptop. So there you have it. The Mac tax is in action, but now you know how much it's going to cost you if you want to put some upgrades into this, or maybe just start with a higher end model like the 1999 model. If you do want a 1 terabyte SSD though, it's going to be $600, which is almost twice the going rate for Windows laptop manufacturers, or if you bought an M.2 SSD yourself, a fast one. That said, the RAM and the SSD are soldered on. They're a part of the motherboard here, which has been the case ever since Apple came out with this particular design for the MacBook Pro model. So buy it the way you want it. You can't upgrade it afterwards. The battery is kind of difficult to replace as always because it's that separate multiple cell design and it's glued to the upper casing. So it can be replaced, but you're going to want to take it to a Genius Bar or have Apple to do it. It's not something that you would do yourself. The display is Apple's usual 1680 by 1050 IPS display. It's a glossy display, but with really good management of glare. And hopefully that coating has a little better longevity than it did a couple of years ago, where it sometimes wore off. I think that they got that under control now. The only thing that's changed here now is we have the True Tone display option, like on the iPad Pro and also the 2018 15-inch MacBook Pro. And that's a pretty nice feature. I like it a lot because I care about kind of color accuracy and not having too much blue-white light burning my eyeballs when I'm sitting in the living room at night under kind of not very bright ambient light. It looks at the ambient light and it adjusts the warmth or the coolness of the display. So if you're sitting in that man or woman cave kind of place with not a lot of ambient lighting, it's going to warm up the display and make it more yellow. If you don't like that, you can turn that off. There is no adjustment slider like Windows has for its night light mode, however, so you either take it or you leave it. I like it. The display, the color accuracy out of the box is pretty good, a little too cool, but it's pretty good overall. And once you turn on True Tone, it actually makes it pretty much just spot on. As ever, the gamut is excellent on this. It covers P3 color gamut, which is a color space that's used in the film industry. It really isn't the most useful for the rest of us in the world, other than watching cinematic movies on your MacBook Pro, but it still does very well complete full sRGB coverage, for example, 91% of Adobe RGB, same specs as on the 15-inch MacBook Pro. Gamma is spot on. Contrast is certainly above average. You can see the metrics on screen. It's a fantastic display. It is one of the selling points other than the fact there is no touchscreen option and there certainly ain't no pen option. The laptop has a 58 watt-hour battery, which is a reasonable sized battery. It ships with the same USB-based 61-watt charger and the 2-meter USB-C cable. And if you want that extension cable, they're still charging extra these days, which is kind of insulting at the price too. And I'm going to keep moaning about that until they do something about that. So they claim up to 10 hours of wireless web use, as they call it. And basic everyday productivity, doing Netflix, doing some Photoshop, that sort of thing, not playing Fortnite, because that will certainly have lower battery life. Typically, I saw 8 to 8.5 hours easily enough, and that's with brightness set to around 200 nits. It's a little bit brighter than I would usually do with a Windows laptop, but because this display gets so bright and it's so gorgeous, who can resist? So that's a 13-inch MacBook Pro for 2018. If you have a 2016 or a 2017 model, it could be tempting to upgrade just because you're doubling the core count, and the performance jump is significant. You saw that comparison that we had between the 2017 and the 2018 models, running a couple of benchmarks, and yeah, it is significant. However, if you didn't like the 2016 and 2017 MacBook Pros because of the various compromises, that incredibly shallow, slightly annoying to me keyboard, which at least is less noisy now, the lack of legacy ports, i.e. the ports that we still all use every day, like USB-A ports and HDMI, those things are still against it, as is the price tag. If you're a Mac OS person, then it's probably worth it to you because you want to stick with Mac OS. If you're somebody who lives in both Windows and Mac worlds, obviously it's a beautiful machine. You get some nice performance out of this that you won't see in a competing 15-watt Ultrabook, but you're paying for it too. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more cool tech videos, and thumbs up if you like this vid.